and I will hand it over to Katie.
Okay, great, thank you. So hi everybody, and welcome to the latest of the monthly RSVP digital events. Those are organised by the Digital Events Committee, which consists of me, Katie Birch, Preeti Joshi, Surav Chatterjee, Ali Hatapshi, Andrew Hobbs and Thomas Smits. So we have events most months. Today we're doing a Pick-A-Periodical session with Clare Stainthorp, who is, sorry, wish I get it right, a Leverhulme Trust Early Career Fellow at Queen Mary University of London, who works on the 19th century freethought press. And she's going to be talking to us about Secular Chronicle, which hopefully you've had a chance to read in advance. And to put the links back in the, oh, thank you. The link is in the chat if you haven't had a chance to look at it already. And so Claire's going to do an introduction for a bit, and then we'll open up to questions, comments, observations after that. So over to you, Claire.
Thank you. Yeah, let me just get this slides just shared so you can sort of see a couple of things. But yeah, hopefully you've been able to sort of open that Google link and let me just share this properly. Right, hopefully you can all see that nicely. So yeah, firstly, it's just such a joy and a privilege to be asked to do this, because I think we all know, as people work in periodicals, quite often people don't actually read the same things you're reading, and so I'm just really excited to hear yeah, your insights, thoughts, what's sort of weird or familiar about this periodical, which I think is quite typical of the freethought press more broadly. And just as a kind of clarification, when I'm talking about the freethought press, it's sort of denoting some kind of sort of secularist, atheist, agnostic kind of irreligious stance, but also the term free thought is being used in the 19th century to also speak to the kind of radical reform nature of the movement as well. So they're generally agitating for workers' rights, suffrage, secular education, access to birth control pamphlets and things like that. They're Republican, as in anti-monarchist. They're sometimes socialist, sometimes very much not socialist, but generally there's this sense that they are free thinkers, and so they're not always agreeing. There's a huge amount of infighting, but that is because their platform is freedom of speech, thought and freedom of press as well, is really key to generally what these people are sort of agitating for. So I think they're very much, I've called them dialogic spaces in a 2022 Victorian Periodicals Review article, if you want to go look at that, where I don't talk about the Secular Chronicle specifically, but I talk about a couple of other ones, the National Reformer and the sort of Agnostic Journal and Secular Review. Now, the reason I've chosen the Secular Chronicle specifically, there is something very interesting in it, I think, particularly in terms of how it uses these illustrated front pages, and that's something I'm excited to talk with you about. But there's really mostly a pragmatic reason for choosing this one specifically out of the various periodicals that I'm looking at in my research more broadly, and that's because it is one of the only ones that is digitized. So as a result, it's one of the few ones I can actually send you a Google Books link for. So that's the kind of starting point really for why I've sort of set this one out as the one to talk about. But as I say, I think there's loads in there. So as I say, I assume most people will not have come across the Secular Chronicle before. So I'm just going to do a quick overview of, I suppose, not necessarily its rise and fall, but its 7-year lifespan in the 1870s. If you want to look at other volumes of this periodical, the easiest way to do it is actually, there's a link that I think will be dropped in the chat for the Humanist Heritage website. They have a short profile of the Secular Chronicle, but at the bottom of that, link to all the different Google Books pages where the different volumes are, and that's the one that I always use as my bookmark to sort of find them rather than trawling through the Google Books pages. So it was established as a halfpenny monthly in August 1872. It rises quickly to a penny by January 1873 and also doubles in size. And then really sort of showing that there is a market for it, it then becomes a weekly by October 1874. So it's established by George H. Reddalls along with David Kirkwood and Thomas Evans, and they're really sort of significant figures within the Midlands and specifically Birmingham secular societies. So this is really its USP in the first instance. When it is established, there is only one other free thought periodical in Britain that's currently going. There have been other ones earlier in the century, but in 1872, the only other one is Charles Bradlaugh's National Reformer, which is the organ of the National Secular Society. And the Secular Chronicle wasn't really looking to frame itself as a competitor specifically. I think they saw that as quite dangerous. They're very careful in the second issue to very clearly praise Bradlaugh and all the work he's been doing. But what they say in that same article in the second issue is that there is nothing by which Bradlaugh may be so well known as by a study of that paper, the National Reformer, containing as it does a record of the great work of his life. And I think there is definitely a sort of little nudge there to sort of saying, well, there's a gap in the market then for a free thought paper that's less clearly aligned with this very specific kind of very clearly atheist free thought that Charles Bradlaugh, who is very interested in the sort of politics, sort of secular politics, reformist politics, trying to get, he tries to get himself elected as an MP and sort of does by the early 1880s, and there's a lot of back and forth in terms of him taking his seat, which I won't go into, but really they see themselves to an extent as doing something a bit alternative to that kind of free thought agitation, which can be more expansive and is sort of more aligned to what George Jacob Holyoake sees as the sort of secularist cause, which is more about a sort of some kind of pluralism, but taking religious power out of and power structures out of society. But its other opening USP really is that it's explicitly for free thought networks beyond London, Midlands, and sort of then the North is kind of what they are sort of showing that there is a free thought press outside London, I think is quite a significant element of the Secular Chronicle. And so Reddalls, as a Birmingham printer and publisher, as the president of Birmingham Secular Society, as well as being linked to and vice president of the British National Secular Society, that's what he's sort of doing. It's got this provincial press element to it that's significant, especially in the early years. So then we kind of have the second chapter of the Secular Chronicle. After 1875, when Reddalls dies, his father very briefly takes over editorship, but then it is bought by Harriet Law, and she actually buys the copyright, becomes the editor, but actually also buys the plant and publishing business from Reddalls' father. So she sort of takes on this whole kind of publishing concern, printing concern. She continues it as a 1-penny weekly. The volume numbers say the same. It isn't like there's a sort of, this isn't a new series. It's seen as having a very clear continuity. But nonetheless, things do shift. It starts to be, she is based in London, so it does sort of become somewhat more London-centric, although you can still see that the reports of society meetings that are being published in it remain focused on the Midlands and the north of England. So that does continue to fill that sort of niche. By the sort of mid-1870s, Harriet Law was really well established as a free thinker. She was one of the most prominent women in the movement, the co-founder of the British Secular Union in 1877. She was also a very active socialist. She was the only woman on the General Council of the First International and was actually sort of like very much part of the milieu in London where the refugees of the Paris Commune, when they came to London, she's sort of part of those circles as well. So she's very clearly socialist, which, as I say, is something that puts her at odds with some other people in the movement. And we see that in her opening address to readers that's on this page. Liberty, equality, and fraternity will be its motto. Obviously, that sort of resonance of the sort of French political radicalism. She's also very proactive in putting women's rights there as a pillar of free thought activism. And the quote I have on the left-hand side of this page, which is just from the second page of this opening issue where she's editor, she clearly states that she's this atheist, Republican, and women's rights advocate. And those are the three things that she uses to sort of, sort of label her form of secularism. But what she goes on to say there, and speaks to this dialogic idea, is that she says the columns will be accessible to all Christians and secularists alike who treat their subjects with competence and their opponents with courtesy. So this idea of there being an informed debate, that people can have their platform and then readers can make up their own minds. Often that's a more aspirational thing than a reality, in the sense that we know that there's a lot of editorial control in terms of what's actually published and how it's framed. But nonetheless, this is always sort of an aspiration of the free thought movement of kind of making up your own mind. But by December 1878, Harriet Law is finished with the Secular Chronicle. Really, it's financial issues, as usually it is with free thought papers. She passes the editorship on to George Standring in December 1878. It then becomes a monthly again, and then very quickly by March of that following year, it has ceased publication. And yeah, as I say, this is quite a sort of standard rise and fall of a free thought publication. Generally, they are not very self-sustaining in terms of the money, and editors are usually losing money quite actively, and that's the kind of thing that means that they don't always have a very, very long publication span. So one of the reasons I chose this particular volume of the Secular Chronicle was because of how nicely I think it sort of reflects on the idea of the radical press, what it can do, what it is. And I think particularly this lovely front page, which I thought was a great one to be able to use as the advertising for the Pick-A-Periodical session of Richard Carlisle's shop front. That's this kind of reminder of the sort of material spaces, right, where the radical press is circulating, that freedom of press is really key to the free thought movement. It's not just freedom of thought, but actually that you should be able to circulate these ideas. And freedom of press is really something, it is something that gets free thinkers across the 19th century into a lot of trouble. Printers, publishers and editors are constantly being dogged with blasphemy and obscenity charges. There's a very good book, if people don't know it, Joss, I don't know if you can see me on screen currently, but Joss Marsh's Word Crimes from 1997 is fantastic at, from kind of the early 19th century right to the end, the various different blasphemy charges that dog the free thought movement. So if you're interested in that side of things, I definitely recommend Joss Marsh's book on that. But Carlyle and those around him and the publication of the Oracle of Reason was a really prominent example of this. So Law has already published a portrait and a biography of Carlyle in November of the previous year, and then says, according to our promise, we issue this week a portrait of the front of Carlyle's bookshop. This is actually the only illustrated front page that isn't a literal portrait of a person. And so this idea that we have a portrait of a bookshop instead, I think is both quite delightful and but also sort of fascinating in sort of thinking about, yeah, as I say, the radical press as being something that has a very clear past, but also moves into the present and the future, right? We are showing the radical press of the past, but right now you have the radical press of the present in the Secular Chronicle, and that we continue to be sort of grateful for the efforts of those like Carlyle for trying to change the sort of society so these radical ideas can get published. And this sort of theme draws through the New Year's greeting that Law then publishes, which is on the second page of the January 6th issue, in which I don't think it's an accident that she's then thinking about the struggles and triumphs of this publication specifically. She sort of says, we've been running it for 3 years now, Law has. And as is a very frequent editorial refrain in free thought publications, they're talking about the need to extend circulation, the fact that they have very limited means, they're very financially precarious, that they need readers to band together to increase circulation, increase subscriptions, all that sort of things. But also Law is laying out her ideas for the future as well. She's thinking both practically that she wants to enlarge the size of the paper, but also ideologically. In the final paragraph, she talks about the promise of a happier new year, during which she calls readers to strive to realise the hope we thus express, but more than hope, let us strive to realise it. With a wider and better directed endeavour for the reclamation and enlightenment of our brethren by ever renewed attempts to gain a clear mental sky, a purer moral atmosphere, So therefore, yeah, bringing about a secular future, a better, more equal future. So this is the kind of refrain that is very familiar, that sort of continues throughout the 19th century free thought press. But there's also something nice in here in the way that she acknowledges the networks within the print publication as well. So in the sort of bottom of the column and then top of the second column, we have her actually thanking key contributors, noting that this is unpaid labour, but that there are also many others, too many to name, anonymous, pseudonymous people who are contributing material, right? So there's this real sense, I think, of, you know, what the sort of Secular Chronicle and its sort of networks kind of actually are here. And she also mentions as a particular triumph the portraits and memoirs of distinguished freethinkers and reformers that she's been publishing over the previous year or so. And so I'm now just for the last sort of couple of minutes going to point to a couple of different things that I think are interesting, but I can definitely talk about them all more. But as I say, I'm keen to hear it from you guys, as well as me just telling you what I find. These life narratives, though, are a really notable feature of the Secular Chronicle. They're originally advertised as famous free thinkers as a series. A lot of them are actually written by Harriet T. Law, which is Harriet Law's daughter. Harriet Theresa Law is the daughter of Mrs. Harriet Theresa Law, which makes it very confusing. I didn't realise this until a very kind colleague pointed this out, that they were actually two different people. So this is also a family concern as well. We get to see what's kind of going on behind the scenes a little. There are 43 articles. The majority of them are sort of illustrated with portraits, such as this one. This is the one of George H. Reynolds, Reddalls, so the original editor and a person who established the Secular Chronicle. So again, the idea of thinking about the past, present, and future of the Secular Chronicle's publications. And so she's using these profiles to sort of record the lives and images of free-thinking individuals, some of which are very famous. Like, you know, we've got Thomas Paine and people like that, but others who I think might be forgotten. And another element of the free thought press I'm really interested in is the way that it tries to maybe reduce the ephemerality of what are often working class lives. So someone like George Reddalls, I'm not sure we would have a portrait of him if we didn't have this specific portrait on the front of the Secular Chronicle in 1878. And actually, we don't have any images, as far as I'm aware, of Harriet Law herself. And I think if only she had written her own biography and put her own portrait on the front at some point, wouldn't that have been nice? But she declined to. So we don't have that. But there's also something interesting happening here with the way that it is typeset and formatted. And so here we have the first page and then the second page, so the back of the front page being shown on the screen, and we have this blank square in the middle, which for a long time puzzled me because I was looking at it on Google Books and the scan just shows it as a blank square. But what I realized when I finally got to see it in person in a library, and I can't find my photo of this, which is really annoying because I was going to try and transform it into the version which is sort of a photo that I have taken where it's more visible, which is that the image of Reddalls, or whoever the portrait is, actually shines through the paper. So you can actually, it's sort of mirrored, it becomes a window where you can get the second page illustrated as well as the first page with that single print. I think that's quite unusual, but I know I'm in a room full of people who are very knowledgeable about the press and the 19th century in general, and I'd love to know if this is a common or well-known technique at all. But it of course speaks to how important it is to try and look at these things in person or in real life. But also, yeah, this idea of what we can be thinking about the materialities of text and print. I also just want to briefly talk about the poetry. I'm not going to dive into what the poetry is that I'm showing on this screen necessarily, though I'm always happy to talk about the poetry, any poetry really. But I thought thinking about RSVP and where people's interests are, if the idea of, sort of radicalism and various other bits of the press I've talked about don't pique your interest, I know there's lots of people who are really interested in the role of poetry in the press. So I just wanted to really note, firstly, that there's a lot of poetry in the free thought press. There's usually at least one poem per issue in the Secular Chronicle. There's a lot of original poetry, but there's also a lot of reprinting, often from other radical periodicals or more sort of canonical things. They love Shelley, as you might expect, people like that they're sort of reprinting things from. This is a particularly nice example because it's actually dedicated to the Secular Chronicle. So again, we're thinking about the place that the Radical Press had, you know, in the lives of the readers, and why someone might wish to dedicate an ode to the triumph of truth in the Secular Chronicle, and sort of really what that enabled. And yeah, it's a sort of, it's not a particularly innovative poem in a lot of ways, and actually that's very usual, even though free thinkers are generally having big new ideas about how maybe society is going to be structured. They're very rarely interested in having new ideas about how poetry is going to be structured. They're generally quite traditional, quite sort of codified forms. And yeah, they're very rarely formally radical. And I would recommend Elizabeth Caroline Miller's book on the late Victorian radical press. She has a brilliant chapter about more broadly in the radical press, how traditional forms of poetry tend to be the ones that the radical press chooses, and I think it's that all kind of aligns with what's happening in free thought specifically as well. So I, as I always have to talk about poems, but I also want to hear from you. So I'm just going to finish with I guess a page which, these are two questions which I prompted when I was yeah, sort of initially asked to sort of put together a blurb for this talk today. And I think hopefully both of them I've started to think about with what I've told you, but I'm also really interested in your perspectives on this too, that there are so many different forms of content in any periodical, but obviously a periodical such as this, and how are these different kinds of forms functioning? And I suppose in terms of where my larger research is going, very often what I'm thinking about is that different kinds of form and content are often negotiating the tension that is at the heart of the free thought movement, which is that they highlight both individual freedom, but also a desire for community. And that I think generally that's the negotiation that's happening in the Secular Chronicle through kinds of material I've talked about, through lots of other kinds of material I haven't talked about. And yeah, so I'm just really interested to hear your thoughts. I'm sorry, I think I've spoken very quickly, but I'm just so keen to hear from you. Thank you for listening.
Great, thank you ever so much. That was really fascinating. Great, so yes, this should be fun. This was fun to read about. So does anybody have any comments, questions, thoughts, observations? If you do, can you put up your hand, your Zoom version of a hand? I can't see who's applauding and who's putting their hand up. I think, I think people are just applauding at the moment. I can only see a few people on the screen, so if you could either use your digital hand or put it in chat if you have anything that you want to
I think
say.
John Christopher Vivian has.
Right, sorry. You're on mute.
That's my first Zoom thing. Yes, there's a very interesting talk on the Secular Chronicle. I was interested, I looked at it briefly and I came across something which interested me from a sort of German perspective, was contributions by William McCall on the legend of Prometheus, translations of Gustavus Schwab, who was unknown to me, but and I'm curious about her portrayal of Marx. He was also one of the free thought worthies that she writes about, and of course there is an original review of Marx himself of a work on the International Working Men's Association, George Howe, I think it is. And just generally this relationship between socialism and secularism. And it's known that Marx attended some lectures of Charles Bradlaugh in the late 1860s, I think, not the 70s. I think it was the late 1860s. and he was rather critical of this. He referred to him as the professional atheist or the bishop of atheism. And there's some tendencies in Marx's critique that he didn't wish to become, he didn't want the working class movement to adopt sort of a stringent atheism, because he saw it as sort of alien. I only discovered that quite interesting. Because later on in the development of secularism in English thought, you get sort of fractures between the aggressive atheism and agnosticism, and I mean, it spins out into different fields. But it struck me as interesting that Karl Marx figures, quite prominently in this edition of the Secular Chronicle, and whether you have some, comments to that.
Yeah, no, I think it is really.
I don't know. Did you hear me? I'm not sure if you heard me.
Yes, yeah. There's a couple of points where I think you pulled
Yes, okay,
slightly, but I got the whole. I'm pretty sure I got the full sense of it, and
just got the
so,
gist. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh no, I heard, I think, almost all of it. Oh, all of it really. So yeah, and I think the question of socialism broadly, and then Marx specifically, in relation to the Secular Chronicle, is very framed around Harriet Law and who she was and what her position was, as I say, within the sort of communists, as in like the Paris Commune communists of the were kind of in London in the sort of 1870s, and she had already been very engaged with the sort of socialist movement prior to taking on the Secular Chronicle. And as I say, I think this is a real key part to what her what she brings to it, which I think isn't really there when it's under Reddalls editorship before. It's a real, as I say, point of contention within free thought. There are people who are socialist, like Harriet Law, and also like Annie Besant, but this is going a bit on a tangent, but Annie Besant and Charles Bradlaugh co-edit the National Reformer for quite a while, end of the 1870s into the 1880s. And the reason that they break and Annie Besant stops doing that is because she becomes more socialist, and Bradlaugh just does not believe that socialism is part of free thought or part of his sort of atheist sort of ideals for where society is going. He's much more interested in sort of the individualism. Like, if we've got free thought, then everyone needs to be thinking for themselves, right? It's that kind of free thought. Whereas even though he's socially radical in some ways, it's not socially radical in this way. So yeah, it doesn't surprise me. I don't think I'd heard that comment that Marx made before about Bradlaugh and hearing him talk, but that doesn't surprise me at all. They're just not really aligned in the kind of thing that they're interested in doing, with all the kind of they think that society should be doing to sort of progress effectively, right? But whereas Law, yeah, is very much more aligned with. I don't know enough about her sort of, really personal politics, and actually I think her work within the sort of socialist circles in London it's something I think is very under-researched. It's only something I've become aware of quite recently, quite how embedded she was in these circles. So I feel like I'm sort of talking around it rather than necessarily, sort of providing you with much more enlightenment on that. But I think hopefully what this shows is that, yeah, sort of by people might not be looking in places like this for this kind of engagement, but if you're especially just more interested in sort of the fact that there's German material at all and that people are engaging with sort of literature, philosophy, ideas from the continent, that is something that is a real marker of a lot of material in a lot of the free thought periodicals. There is a general sense that this is a national movement, and Germany and France and Italy being sort of really key places where there are constant sort of circulations of material, ideas, yeah, they're sort of, by the end of the century, there were sort of international free thought congresses where people are all going together and sort of having these kinds of conversations. So it is not a parochial movement. It's not just thinking about Britain by any means. I think when you're thinking about, you know, some variety of humanism, some kind of humanity based thing, it's about sort of, yeah, they're sort of keen to think well beyond national borders.
Great, thank you. I think Patrick was next.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, just three quick things that struck me, and anything you care to say about them would be interesting. I too was very interested in these portraits, and they make she makes rather a big point about they got this new process. And of course, in the 70s, there's a lot of these photographic processes that are making it possible, even for a penny weekly, to feature these. And I thought it was very interesting that you could, for a penny, you could go to her office and you could buy one of these as a standalone print.
Yeah.
To post up, you know, for inspiration. But yeah, anyway, I found these very interesting. I also noticed that, and there's so much to, thank you for introducing us to this periodical, or at least to me. I'd never looked through it before. So many interesting things. The notices to correspondence alone is completely fascinating, where she's carrying on these simultaneous conversations with all these people. I noticed in those pen portraits, there's a lot of emphasis on periodicals. I mean, she very often mentions that the editorial and publishing history of these different figures, what periodicals they were associated with. And of course, a lot of the editorializing also quotes from current periodicals, from The Echo or, you know, other ones. And I thought that was where so you really do get a sense, not just of the free thought press, but of the press more generally. And finally, because I'm working on a project about that involves 19th century reformists who are also spiritualists, I was very interested in this anti-spiritualist thing they've got going, which I gather from reading Reddalls' profile was he unmasked it. He unmasked some spiritualists, and so there's a thread running through the periodical of anti-spiritualism. And in Law's portrait of Robert Dale Owen, she explains away his later spiritualism as being a symptom of his mental breakdown at the end of his life, which I thought was some interesting special pleading. Anyway, just a few impressions.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for all of those, Patrick. Yeah, I think yeah, the question of those portraits being actually just a really important thing for the potential to sort of put into the home a portrait that is either sort of picked up from her offices for a penny, or even I think literally sort of just taken from the front page and sort of cut down. I think these really will have had sort of like lives beyond the sort of being part of a sort of, you know, the sort of not bound, but, you know, part of the periodical itself. I do think that they're sort of seen as having this sort of real extra value to them, and that obviously, even though it was becoming cheaper, it still obviously would be much more expensive to be doing this than not doing this. And that she sort of saw this as a way of, I suppose, also really distinguishing it from the National Reformer, the fact this is the other one that's going on at the same time, that really doesn't have any of this kind of, Joe, is much more about the sort of current affairs of free thought, the politics, and sort of wider sort of political and social things that are happening. So it really is kind of giving them the distinctiveness. In terms of, yeah, this where it plays of spiritualism and anti-spiritualism, this is another thing that is a quite distinctive point of not so much debate in the sense of the way that socialism really does split the movement, but in terms of where do you place the boundaries of free thought, I suppose, is the kind of easiest way to sum this up. Are we talking about a push against just the most sort of organized state religion and all of those structures that keep state religion in place, and sort of all the sort of problems in society they see that as causing? Or are we actually talking about a sort of in which case, if that's what we're talking about, then there are blurry boundaries where things like spiritualism and other kinds of more sort of esoteric thought can sort of have a place within it. And certainly in other periodicals, there is much more of a space for it. So the Secular Review, which becomes the Agnostic Journal, the editor of that, William Stewart Ross, who writes and edits under the name Saladin, he does absolutely allow sort of spiritualist and sort of theosophical and sort of other kinds of material to be published, because I think he just sees it as a sort of very broad umbrella, whereas yeah, someone like certainly Reddalls is very sort of anti-spiritualism. Charles Bradlaugh is very anti-spiritualism, but even then they will often allow correspondence from people to write from that perspective and put it in, and then maybe there's an editorial note that says effectively, we think it's important to put this out there, but we don't think we don't agree. Sometimes there's like an editorial positioning of it, or other times it's that it's part of a dialogue and a back and forth. And yeah, I think because Reddalls, like you say, you've done your homework, does indeed have this sort of whole thing where he is sort of actively sort of trying to do the debunking of spiritualism, that sort of sets it up. I haven't really actually thought that carefully about then how it appears in the later issues with Law, and whether that is something she kind of upholds, or whether she kind of lets that sort of open out into a blurrier boundary again. I would have to sort of spend this time thinking about how that shifts. But yeah, as with most things, it's they're sort of interested in thinking about the boundaries, I think, quite often because they're interested in thinking about what is our, community, what is our position, how are we kind of standing against some sort of other, and sometimes the other really is just the sort of state religion, and other times the other is sort of anything that sort of draws on the idea of the spiritual over the secular. So yeah.
So those fault lines are so interesting, not least because so much of spiritualism in the 19th century was allied with social reform, with feminism particularly, because women rose to prominence within the movement, and utopian, it's sort of utopianism, utopian communities, and was very in many cases aggressively secular, or drew upon Unitarians like William McCall, and Universalist ministers, and so on. So it's very interesting that there'd be this policing of the boundaries, I thought, in there. So yeah, no, thank you very much. I'm very interested to hear more about that.
But there is often this move as well, like you say, the fact that Owen sort of moved into that in later years, and then there was a way that maybe Law was trying to say that is not an appropriate thing for him to end up doing, or she disapproves. But Annie Besant, she becomes a theosophist and becomes leader of the sort of International Theosophical Society, right? So it's also not an unusual move when people are really just thinking about, I'm questioning the status quo and I'm searching for truth, and some are more open to where that truth might lead them, and sometimes it leads them in much more spiritual directions.
Could I say something?
Yes.
Yeah, there's an interesting work by, I think it's Timothy Larson, where he's on reconversions.
Yeah.
And he treats the character who was a central secularist, George Sexton, who also was an editor for the National Reformer, I think. But he starts off as a key characteristic of, oh, you have it there, okay.
Yeah.
George Sexton, but I think Larson uses the term fluidity to describe a characteristic of free thinkers in the 19th century. Annie Besant is another good example of this movement from religiosity to atheism, then to socialism, Fabianism, and then later theosophy. George Sexton is another one. I mean, they all start off from a religious background. The fluidity between secularism and socialism particularly interests me. This takes place by Annie Besant is around about 1884, 1883, and also this hostility of Bradlaugh's to socialism is interesting. It's possible. I just wanted to say about the fluidity of these characters. Sexton was somebody who started off as a religious figure, a scientist. He was quite an eminent scientist. Then he became a communist and worked with Marx, I think, attended some conference in Europe. Then he became a Unitarian, and then later on he became a spiritualist. So he's perhaps an interesting figure to look at, that goes through a whole gamut of different world views, if you want to look at it like that, ways of seeing the world. And
no, and I think it's
they all seem to be characteristic. They all have this quality of moving to different sorts of ways of thinking. And of course, if you look at the Unitarian tradition in England, it's the dissenting tradition. It is necessarily contrary to the establishment creed, if you like. They have this inborn an inborn quality to dissent from regular opinion.
Absolutely.
Understand it.
Yeah. No, and I think that's
the case that the Secular Chronicle. I was saying it could be the case that the Secular Chronicle, with these images of all these free thought worthies, and of course this, images of Karl Marx, which, as you correctly say, wouldn't have appeared in Bradlaugh's National Reformer in quite the same way, although he did recognize him. But is that a quality of this Secular Chronicle that makes it different from the National Reformer, that it was appealing to perhaps another taste in the public, in the free-thinking public, free-thought public?
Yeah, I think it finds its own niche. It is doing something sort of distinctive in that way. But what I would say is that I suppose you're absolutely right. Obviously, as you say, Timothy Larson has written his book Crisis of Doubt, which is about the move away from free thought as well as towards free thought that a lot of people do not necessarily end their life as free thinkers, even if they were prominent in the free thought movement during their life. And I've certainly been very influenced by David Nash's work, which I think is, I would say, to me resonates more clearly with the idea. He talks about religious and moral seeking and a sort of ideological openness to change. And I feel like Larson probably overstates how many people ended up returning to faith. I think he overstates that argument personally, but it doesn't mean to suggest that it doesn't exist. And it absolutely, there's a lot of movement, and that no one is. There's a real. Even the idea of labels is quite difficult. So the reason I use the term free thought is because they're all even arguing around, are you an atheist or a secularist? Are you on board this new term agnostic that Huxley's just come up with? All of these kinds of questions are things that people are always sort of battling with. But I think what I find in the periodicals, because I think their main purpose is to try and cohere a movement, is that when someone then does move away from free thought, especially if they've been a lecturer, someone on the circuit, someone that's familiar from columns, there will be a lot of editorial or other writing which seeks to rationalize what's happened, and also quite often seeks to try and I don't know, I can't think of the right word, not blacklist, but really sort of say, well, this person has done this and we feel betrayed. And this feels like this is undermining what we see as a very specifically sort of coherent movement, which is the future. And I think you'll see that, for example, in the poetry and in a lot of the writing in these periodicals, is that this is the future, this is the coming age, this new secular bright age where we are released from the shackles of religion and can be more equal. And it's utopianism, it's an absolute utopianism. And people that I suppose from the perspective of people writing in these periodicals fail that they there's a sense that it can't really be understood And there's very rarely a real sense of understanding as to why they've made this shift. And yeah, Annie Besant's wonderful pamphlet, which is called Why I Became a Theosophist. No, Why I Am a Theosophist, rather, is her trying to explain to her free thought comrades what on earth she's done, because they are just appalled and feel completely betrayed. So I think because quite often I'm looking at this from obviously I'm interested in the wider movement and all of the movements and people that are moving in it, but my interest is how is the movement being kind of shaped by these periodicals? How's the work in the periodicals actually trying to imagine this movement into being? Might even be a way to consider talking about it. So I think that's my perspective, rather than, I suppose, in some ways, I don't want to say the realities, because that suggests that what's in the periodicals isn't real, but I think often the way it's being explained in a periodical like this for a free thought movement readership is quite different to the complexities and the blurry edges. So yeah, but thank you for bringing up those ideas, John.
Okay, great, thank you. I think Thomas was next, and then there's a question in chat, and then Preeti, and then there's another question in chat. So I'll just kind of move between the two. So Thomas next, please.
Yeah, thank you. That was great. So I just browsing to the periodical, I saw a lot of discussion on, and you already mentioned that, about developments abroad, right, in Germany and France. So I was wondering, concerning sort of the transnational element of this periodical, like, is this only a reflection of her sort of international interests, or are we also seeing this, or should we see this periodical as a sort of an element in the transnational network? So are there articles being translated? So is it also supporting a sort of a transnational network of people that are all interested in the same things? And being especially interested in the images myself, I was also wondering, do these portraits also travel abroad, right? Or are they coming from other countries? Thank you. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's something that I think I reflect on a lot, and I probably don't have a clear answer on yet, at least. I certainly I don't have specific, I suppose, evidence to sort of explain quite how far these things are circulating outside of Britain. I think it's less clear in the Secular Chronicle, as far as I can remember, but in some of the other periodicals, you get it a lot more in the correspondence page columns, where there's sort of notes from how far it is reaching, and people are writing. What's the word? Yeah, people are writing from other countries to sort of engage in this sort of network of discussion. So it's not just aspirational, but I think the Secular Chronicle, perhaps also because it's a slightly earlier one, I think even comparing the 1870s to the sort of 1890s, in terms of, I would need to do a lot more work to sort of back this up if I was going to write it down and publish it anywhere. But I think that the extent to which these things are circulating does build, and certainly there are sort of more sort of different international free thought organizations as the century sort of progresses. Yeah, I'm not sure. This is a very, I feel it's not a very satisfactory answer. Something that I am writing in the future is about the sort of international connections coming out of these periodicals, and so that will eventually be part of an upcoming Edinburgh companion to the Radical Press, I think it is. It's something along those lines anyway. And so yeah, I can always be in touch once I sort of have more ideas that are more firmly fixed about that. But these, yeah, they are, I don't think it isn't just the Secular Chronicle that is aspiring to international yeah, sort of engagement, and there is a sense that they are, yeah, that they are translating things, but not, I wouldn't say that was a major part of what they're publishing, but they are often, this is annoying again, not so much the Secular Chronicle, but other periodicals. One of the things they're quite often doing is sort of providing précis of sort of like key works. Then it might be key sort of like philosophy, science, and often that is coming from the continent, and it's a kind of primer for people who probably won't have got hold of this, may not be able to speak read other languages, but there's a kind of there's like a pedagogic element to some of the other periodicals, but I just think the Secular Chronicle doesn't do that quite as much as some of the other ones.
Great, thank you. I think Seth in the chat was next. So this may be slightly tangential, but if you could throw some light on how the Secular Chronicle contended with changes in terms of its circulation and reach in light of the change strategy of the British establishment to deal with the radical press. Chomsky talks about liberalism being a better remedy than suppression to deal with the Chartist press, not that press repression disappeared altogether. Apart from the hostility and the disdain of Victorian morality percolating within the British government, how did the Secular Chronicle deal with the financial challenges posed by liberalisation on top of the physical and institutional hostility, through what one may assume to be a lack of advertising support, established as it was in 1872, when the modified strategy of liberalisation seemed to be firmly in place?
That is a very good and very well thought out question that I will try and answer to an extent. So as you can sort of see, you mentioned, for example, the advertising, and as you can see, the lack of advertising support in terms of the advertisements that are in there, they are almost all entirely for freethought publishing of some description or other. They're basically they're sort of, you know, they're advertising their own materials. They're very rarely getting anything that would be a sort of an advertiser that you can think, oh, well, they're going to have paid for advertising space. It's very rare. Like, it does happen in a couple of other periodicals slightly more, but in the Secular Chronicle, it just does not happen. And in terms of just the financial viability that that these things had, they just don't. They are all, and including this one, I think, I can't remember whether there would be some elements of it in some of the later editorial things, but they're not above begging. Like, it really is a sort of like, readers, you must help, you must take out more subscriptions. Like, you please, if you can, take out more than one subscription and give one to, you know, your sort of your local like workers reading room, or like among friends, or they're sort of just asking for additional donations. The National Reformer, because it's linked to the National Secular Society, there's an element of, not that it's that Charles Bradlaugh is also losing money throughout the whole of the time it exists, but at least that's linked to membership of the National Secular Society. So there is some element of funds being kind of drawn from somewhere else to sort of draw into this to support it. Whereas the Secular Chronicle doesn't have that. It is nominally linked at some point to the British Secular Union, but that's not a very successful endeavour. It turns out they don't really need a second, slightly different but similar national sort of secular union or society. So I think, yes, I'm just trying to look back at exactly how you're phrased it. Yeah, how do they contend with changes in terms of its circulation and reach? I think it was generally about appeals to a readership. I can't think of specific examples where they're really talking about it being, you know, the establishment, or the sort of the way that the press is being sort of shaped by sort of larger forces, really being the thing that is, in the case of the Secular Chronicle, it's not something that they're talking about. It's much more about, like, this is it's a grassroots movement, and so it's about finding a bigger readership by people, by word of mouth, by all of those sorts of things. So actually that's kind of where it's from. Again, I don't want to keep talking about like other periodicals, because I think this is the one we're sort of hopefully sitting with and thinking about, but that's very different to, say, the Free Thinker, which is established the following decade, which immediately courts controversy. George W. Foote actively really tries to get a blasphemy charge effectively. So, and that's what then pushes the sales up really high, because then that starts getting talked about in the mainstream press, and then there's a kind of interest there and intrigue, and so the numbers skyrocket for that, at least for a time, and then it reduces down again. So there's other ways that they're kind of playing with the idea of what can and can't be printed, and also how sometimes being actively sort of charged with obscenity or blasphemy will actually do more rather than less for your circulation. But the Secular Chronicle doesn't go in for that strategy. For them, I think it's much more about, there is a community here and we can expand this community, because again, it's this sort of utopian, because we know it's the future, so we just need to sort of stick at it and keep trying, and it is just going to build. And I think there's that sort of optimism. But yeah, I don't know whether that's sort of at all what you were what you're sort of interested in there, Akshat. But thank you for the question. It's made me think about it in a slightly different way. I wouldn't usually think about it in those terms. So thank you.
Yeah, that was really interesting. Thank you. I definitely got desperation from some of the articles, but please tell us. I think Pretty was next.
Thanks so much, Claire. I don't have a question so much as a series of a couple of thoughts and comments, and of course they're about the portraits, and then that blank space. So I'm struck by, except for the first one, I think they're bust portraits.
They're all that, yeah.
They're all busts, okay. And I want to think about the difference between the bookshop, which has a devil on the what we in the US call second floor window next to a man there. But so I want to think about the bust photographs for a second, right? So they're almost all, except for the Robert Owen one, they're almost all 3/4 profile. The Robert Owen one is the only one I think that is full frontal, looking directly at the readership. And I'm working on portraiture in India, Mughal portraiture and things like that, and sort of the front sort of decisions about 3/4. There's no profile. This 3/4 versus frontal are really important discussions and thinking about relation between viewer and the person who is portrayed. So it's kind of interesting to me that Robert Owen is the only one who is full frontal, looking directly at the viewer. I'm also just struck by the fact that several of them, not all of them, by any means have signatures. And I'm thinking back to a talk on digital events that Tom Young gave, a really terrific talk, thinking about portraits in Indian periodicals of the 1820s, mostly he was talking about, and the use of signatures in those portraits. And their portraits, these are in periodicals published in India, but by Britons, not by Indians. And the use of the signature there as a authorizing act. And so I'm just again struck by, I think I want to think about those kinds of questions in terms of your question about creating community. So the ways in which and I'm, who is picked, of course, is interesting, right? Mary Wollstonecraft, Annie Besant, George Cruikshank, Darwin. I mean, it's a really sort of wide array of people. But thinking of that sort of the face and the signature as a way of creating a community that still focuses on the individual as a, so there's something about, the thing we talk about in literary studies all the time, there's something about type and yet individual and types, and sort of that dialectic. So I'll stop there, but those are the things that struck me. And I just want to still again say that dead space on page 2 is just so weird. And in some cases it creates a halo around the image on page 1, almost a halo, but then there's sex. So I'm just still intrigued by that. So I'll stop now.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really thoughtful and thought-provoking questions. Yeah, I hadn't thought about the signatures specifically in that way before. And yeah, possibly hadn't thought, well, no, I definitely hadn't thought as carefully about actually the kinds of portraits that are actually being sort of put there. I think I was thinking of them maybe more homogeneously than I should have been. I suppose I don't want to undermine what is a really good question with practicality, but I do think there's an element to which I haven't done the trace work of where have these portraits come from. And I think a lot of them will be versions of ones that were frontises in someone's the life of someone, sort of collected works of someone, those kind, especially for older, or sort of more sort of canonical older figures. And often those also have the signatures as well. And again, it still has that same function, and that's still a choice that's been made to obviously reproduce that signature. So that doesn't invalidate the sort of question of sort of what they're doing there and how they're functioning. But I think, yeah, sort of thinking about actually where these have come from, I haven't done that legwork actually to think about, well, which portrait is this? In some cases, it's quite straightforward. There's only really 1 or 2 extant images of someone. But in other cases, yeah, I think that that's sort of, they're kind of coming from something that's, I guess, easily accessible and copyable. And yeah, I'm sure those of you who know more about the sort of the processes of creating print images can probably speak to that more clearly than I can. But you're right, the idea of the individual and the community is something that's sort of always in tension. And I think the fact that they are quite various in terms of the kind of people they are, some of them really are, you know, sort of like people who've been involved in the recent free thought movement that otherwise you wouldn't have heard of. And other times they are people like Darwin and Mary Wollstonecraft and sort of these sort of people, and Montaigne and things like that. And I think there's a kind of, I suppose in that sort of variousness, I think it does try and speak to this idea that we are not just a very sort of single small movement. I think it's kind of creating a sense of a free thought heritage, a usable past, that kind of feeling of saying, well, actually, sometimes it can feel like we are few, but actually we are many, and so that I'm currently working on a biographical dictionary of free thinkers of all ages and nations that was published in 1889 by J.M. Wheeler. And so that, yeah, that sort of sense of just sort of finding people from the past that you can sort of put into this sort of train of free thinkers, I think is also quite an important thing for what the free thought movement was doing, that they were often being told this was a very new idea. And I still think there's this general sense that, oh, sort of where does atheism just sort of like sprouted up, you know, around Darwin or something like, or that it just sort of sprouted up sort of in the early 19th century, and that actually sort of finding these sort of longer legacies is part of it. But I still think that they do then return again and again to the individual. This is a sort of mass movement. It's about sort of people, sort of a rank and file of sort of workers coming together is sometimes, especially how they're writing about themselves, and therefore it is not a contradiction, but it is a tension but when they're then talking about their history, they're still zooming in on the individual, and rather than thinking about how people as a movement can come together and have come together sort of historically. So yeah, so even the picture of this is a thing I've thought about in relation to the Carlisle shopfront, and for the kind of history of, obviously there are kind of these images, there's this devil figure, there's this clergyman who I think has a pig head, though I could be reading that incorrectly. Like there are these sort of there are these figures, but for those who are aware, would have been aware, readers who would have been aware of all of the agitation that happened around Richard Carlisle and the Oracle of Reason and his shop, what sort of happened was that he was imprisoned, and then originally his sort of family and close friends then sort of took over the shop, and they became imprisoned, and there was this cycle of imprisonment. And then people, just readers of the Oracle of Reason, started to draw, and it was a sort of people were kind of standing up and sort of saying, well, I will take over this premises. And a lot of those people are pretty anonymous, in that even now we don't really have, you know, birth dates and death dates of everyone. We don't necessarily know a lot about these individuals other than the records that are then in the sort of criminal sort of charges and things like that. And so there is a way to think about the Carlisle shopfront as a group portrait rather than a portrait of a building, because it's sort of it is that one moment of like, this is the rank and file, this is an image of radical moment as a movement rather than as an individual, which is yeah, anyway, so that's another thing I've thought about that, which perhaps is too much on a limb, but thanks for letting me talk about the images a bit more, Priti.
Yeah, I really like that idea of a group portrait. That was really interesting. Thank you. Yeah, sorry, this has been really fun, but we've gone past the hour, so I think we are going to have to wrap up now. We won't get to all the questions in chat. Sorry to everybody who had a question.
Yeah,
and
I've
didn't get
sort of
answered.
seen there are all these questions, and I'm sorry I haven't responded to them. But please, anyone email me. I'm always happy to chat about these. So yeah, if there's anything else people think is sort of interesting in these, or they're asking about connections, I might not always have the answers, but I also quite often know the right place to find out those kind of answers, even if I haven't thought about them so much. So yeah, please do get in touch. I can just put my email in the chat, but yeah, hopefully.
And
Claire,
Claire, I will save the chat for you. I will save it and send it to you. So I know Allison just posted a really interesting question and comment, and you just posted your email. So, but I will save the chat for you. So thank you so much. And sorry, we are over the hour. Just a very quick comment about next step. We don't